Please, Dad. My son's hand closed around my wrist. Don't tell them you're my father. I stared at him. We were standing 3 feet from the entrance to the most expensive hotel ballroom I had ever seen. Behind the closed doors, 200 people were celebrating his wedding anniversary. His wife was inside. Her parents were inside. Business partners, friends, neighbors, people from their church. Everyone important to him, apparently. Except me. I looked at my son. Why? He glanced toward the ballroom doors, then back at me. Please, just tonight. His voice was barely above a whisper. I had driven 4 hours to get there. I had brought a gift. I had bought a new suit because he'd told me the event was formal. I had even shaved twice because I was afraid I'd look too old. I was 65. My son, Andrew, was 38. He was the only child I had, and now he was asking me to pretend I wasn't his father. I should have walked away. Maybe that's what a man with more pride would have done. But I had spent my entire adult life learning that pride and fatherhood don't always belong in the same sentence. So I nodded. Fine. Relief crossed his face. Thank you. I looked at the ballroom doors. What am I supposed to tell people? Nothing. What if someone asks? Just say you're a friend of the family. A friend of the family? I almost laughed. I had been in the delivery room when he was born. I had stayed awake beside him through 3 nights of fever when he was 6. I had taken out a second mortgage to pay for his university tuition. I had worked weekends after his mother died so he wouldn't have to quit school. I had attended his graduation, his first job interview, his wedding, his first home purchase. And tonight, I was a friend. I swallowed. Okay. He squeezed my shoulder. I knew you'd understand. I wasn't sure I did, so I stayed. And for the next 3 hours, I watched my son introduce everyone to the successful architect, husband, businessman, and devoted family man he had become. No one introduced me. No one knew who I was. Then, just before dessert, an older man sat down beside me. He was silver-haired, well-dressed, and carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent his life making decisions. Andrew's father-in-law. I had met him only once before. His name was Richard Collins. He looked at me for a moment. Then he asked one question. Why does my son-in-law look so frightened every time he sees you? I didn't answer. Not immediately. Richard turned toward me, and I realized he already suspected the truth. The truth my son had been desperate to hide. The truth that would eventually tear apart the perfect life he had spent years building. My name is Michael Bennett. I was 27 when Andrew was born. His mother, Laura, was 25. We were young, broke, and completely convinced that love was enough. For a while it was. We lived in a small house outside Pittsburgh. I worked construction during the day. At night, I repaired appliances for extra money. Laura worked at a pharmacy. We didn't have much. But Andrew never knew that he had birthday cakes, Christmas presents, a bicycle when he was 9, a second-hand computer when he was 12, and whatever else I could manage. I wasn't a perfect father. I worked too much. I missed some school events. I came home exhausted. Sometimes I fell asleep while he was telling me about his day. But I was there, always there. When Andrew was 14, Laura became sick. Cancer. By the time he was 19, she was gone. That changed both of us. Andrew became quiet. I became obsessed with protecting him. I wanted him to have every opportunity I hadn't had. So when he got accepted into an architecture program, I said yes before he even finished asking. How are you going to pay for it? He asked. I'll figure it out. You don't have to. I know. He smiled. You always say that. I know. I sold my old truck. I picked up extra shifts. I borrowed money. When the tuition still wasn't enough, I took a second mortgage against the house. I never told him the full amount. I didn't want him carrying guilt while he was trying to build his future. He graduated near the top of his class. His first job was with a major architectural firm. Then he started his own company. He became successful, very successful. The first time I visited his office, I stood outside for a full minute before going in. His name was on the glass, Andrew Bennett Design Group. I remember feeling something I couldn't describe: pride, relief, and a little sadness. Because the boy who used to sit at our kitchen table, drawing houses on the back of envelopes, had become a man I sometimes barely recognized. After his career took off, our conversations changed. At first, they stayed warm. Then they became less frequent. Then I started hearing things. Andrew had married Emily. Her family was wealthy, very wealthy. Her father owned a chain of private medical clinics. Her mother sat on several charity boards. They lived in a gated community. They traveled constantly, and Andrew seemed to fit perfectly into their world. I was happy for him, or at least I tried to be. Then I noticed something. Andrew stopped inviting me to important events. His wedding had been small. I attended. But afterward, everything became different. When Emily's family held dinners, I wasn't there. When they traveled, I wasn't mentioned. When they celebrated business milestones, I learned about them later. I didn't complain. I told myself adulthood changed families. Perhaps I was simply making room for the life he had built. Then the invitation arrived. His 10th wedding anniversary. A formal celebration. "Please come," Andrew had told me on the phone. I had smiled. Of course, I thought maybe things were finally changing. I was wrong. When Andrew met me outside the hotel ballroom that evening, I knew immediately something was wrong. "Dad, yes." He looked at my suit. "You came alone?" "Yes." "Good." I frowned. "Good." He rubbed his forehead. "I need you to do something for me." And then he said those words, "Don't tell them you're my father." I should have demanded an explanation. Instead, I went inside. I found a seat near the back. For the first half hour, nobody spoke to me. Then people began introducing themselves. "Are you with the Collins family?" "No." "Andrew's firm?" "No." "Friend of Emily's?" I smiled. "Something like that." That became my answer. Something like that. Then I watched Andrew give a speech about family. He thanked Emily, he thanked her parents, he thanked his friends, he thanked his business partners. He talked about the people who had supported him from the beginning. I listened. Not once did he mention his father. I kept my face still. But when the applause started, I felt something crack inside me, not anger. Something quieter, the realization that my son had built a new history for himself, and I wasn't part of it. After the speech, I stepped outside. I needed air. That's when Richard found me. He stood beside me near the hotel garden. "You're Michael." I looked at him. "How do you know my name?" He smiled. "I know more than you think." I said nothing. He folded his hands behind his back. "Andrew mentioned you once." "Once?" "Yes." "What did he say?" "That you were difficult." I almost laughed. "That sounds like him." Richard studied me. "Is that true?" "No." "Then why aren't you inside with everyone else?" I looked toward the ballroom. I was asked not to say who I was. Richard's expression hardened. "Why?" "I think you know." He was silent. Then he asked, "Are you Andrew's father?" I could have lied. Andrew had asked me to, but I had already spent 3 hours pretending I was tired. "Yes." Richard nodded, not surprised. "Thank you." I frowned. "For what?" "For telling me the truth." Then he asked his second question. "Do you know why my daughter was told that you abandoned Andrew when he was a child?" My stomach dropped. "What?" Richard looked directly at me. "Emily believes her husband was raised by a mother who died young and a father who disappeared." I stared at him. "That isn't true." "I suspected that." "Who told her?" "Andrew." I closed my eyes. Suddenly, things that had never made sense began to make sense. Why Emily barely looked at me. Why her family treated me like an outsider. Why Andrew never corrected them. He hadn't simply hidden me. He had rewritten me. I opened my eyes. "Richard, I never abandoned my son." "I know. How? Because I ran a background check." I stared at him. He continued. "Not on you. On Andrew." "Why?" Richard looked through the ballroom window. "Because 3 years ago he asked me for a very large loan. That was when the evening took a completely different direction. Richard and I sat in a quiet hotel lounge. He ordered coffee. I ordered water. Neither of us touched our drinks. 3 years ago, he said, Andrew came to me with a business proposal." "What kind?" He wanted to expand his company. I nodded. That sounds like him. He asked for $600,000. My eyebrows rose. What? Richard gave a small smile. I didn't give him the money. Why? Because the financial numbers didn't make sense. I said nothing. He told me the company had cash flow problems because of a major project. I nodded. That also sounds like him. I asked to see the contracts. And there were no contracts. I looked at him. What? No signed contract. No client payment schedule. Nothing. Then why did he ask for the money? I don't know. Richard opened his phone. There was more. He turned the screen toward me. Several transfers. All from Andrew's business account. Payments to luxury hotels. Private travel companies, jewelry stores. And one particular company I recognized, a financial services firm. My financial services firm. I stared at the screen. Why would he pay them? Richard looked at me. That's what I want you to tell me. I frowned. I don't understand. He pointed to a transfer. Your name appears on the account. My stomach tightened. My name? Yes. I shook my head. I don't have a business account with him. I know. Richard leaned closer. That's why I asked you to sit down. Showed me another document. It contained my name, my signature, my old home address, and an authorization giving Andrew access to one of my investment accounts. I stared at the page. I never signed this. Richard nodded. I thought so. Where did you get this? Andrew sent it to me. Why? He wanted me to believe you were financially supporting his company. I looked at him. Were you? No, he smiled. I refused. I sat back for the first time that night. I understood why Andrew had wanted me silent. It wasn't embarrassment. It was fear. He wasn't hiding a poor father. He was hiding the one person who could expose the story he had been telling everyone. And apparently there was much more to it. Richard looked at me. Michael, I need to know something. What? Did you ever give Andrew permission to use your identity? No. Did you ever co-sign anything for him? No. Did you ever transfer money into his company? No. He nodded slowly. Then I think you and I are looking at the same problem. What problem? My son-in-law has been lying to both of us. I felt the room get colder. About what? Money. How much? Richard didn't answer immediately. Then he said, more than $2 million. I stared at him. 2 million, possibly more. I couldn't speak. Richard continued. I've spent months trying to understand where it went. And you think he took it? I think he moved it. To where? That is what we haven't found. I looked toward the ballroom. My son was still inside, lowering, shaking hands, standing beside his wife, pretending everything was perfect. I thought about the boy who used to ask me to check his homework, the teenager who couldn't sleep after his mother's diagnosis, the young man who had hugged me after his graduation. Who had that person become? Richard leaned forward. Why did you stay quiet tonight? I answered honestly. Because he asked me to. Richard nodded. Then he said something I never expected. Michael, you may be the only person who can stop him. I looked at him. Why me? Because he still doesn't understand that you're not the man he thinks you are. I frowned. What does that mean? You've spent your whole life quietly cleaning up his problems. I said nothing, Richard continued. He thinks you'll protect him again. I looked at my hands. He was right. That was exactly what Andrew expected. And for the first time I realized that my silence wasn't protecting my son. It was protecting his lies. I stood up. I need to go home, Richard nodded. I'm coming with you. I looked at him. Why? Because I think we're going to need to compare notes. I returned home just before midnight. Richard followed separately. When I unlocked my front door, I had a strange feeling. Something was wrong. The house looked normal. But the desk drawer in my study was slightly open. I froze. I always closed it. Inside that drawer were copies of my financial statements, Protry records, insurance information, private documents. I opened it. One folder was missing, the folder containing copies of my investment accounts. I checked every room. Nothing else appeared disturbed. Richard stood behind me. Was that folder here? Yes. Who knew about it? I thought about it. Andrew, Richard sighed, then we have a bigger problem. I sat down. Why? Because if he has your documents, he can make more copies. I looked at the clock, 12:31 a.m., then my phone rang. Andrew. I stared at the screen. I answered. Dad, yes. Are you home? I looked at Richard. Yes. Good. His voice sounded calm, too calm. I need to talk to you. About what? About tonight. I said nothing. He continued. Did you speak to Richard? I looked at the clock. How did you know he was with me? Silence. Then, he told me. That was a lie. I knew it immediately. Richard hadn't contacted him. Andrew was watching, tracking, controlling, trying to stay ahead. Dad, I need you to do something. What? Delete anything you have related to my company. I felt my pulse rise. Why? Because if anyone asks questions, I don't want them finding old documents. There it was, an admission, not complete, but enough. I looked at Richard. He was already recording the conversation with his phone. I said, Andrew, what did you do? I made mistakes. What kind? Business mistakes. Is that why you used my name? He stopped breathing. Then, who told you? I closed my eyes. That sentence told me everything. Not what are you talking about? Not I didn't. I ended the call. Richard looked at me. You recorded that? He nodded. Every word. I sat down. For the first time in many years. I wasn't trying to save my son. I was trying to understand what he had done. And the next morning, we would discover exactly how far it went. The next morning, Richard introduced me to a financial investigator he trusted. We spent hours reviewing records. The story was worse than I imagined. Andrew had built a successful-looking company using legitimate contracts. But over several years, he had also created a second financial structure. Money from new projects was being transferred into accounts connected to shell companies. Some were controlled by people I had never heard of. Others were linked indirectly to expensive purchases. Cars, jewelry, travel, a vacation property. The luxury lifestyle I had seen at the anniversary dinner wasn't being funded by success. It was being funded by deception. And then we found something that made me feel sick. A transfer to an account bearing my name. The account had been opened using my personal details, my social security number, my old address, my signature. Andrew had taken the documents from my study. He had created an account in my name. Richard looked at me. I think he's been using you as a shield. I nodded. If the money was questioned, he could claim his father had been investing. But you had no idea. No. The investigator leaned back. This is serious, I know. Your identity may have been used in several transactions. I looked at Richard. What happens now? The truth becomes evidence. I swallowed for years. I had protected my son from consequences. Now there was nothing I could do. And perhaps, for the first time, I understood that was exactly what needed to happen. That evening, Andrew came to my house, alone. He stood on the porch. Dad. I looked at him. He seemed exhausted. Can I come in? I stepped aside. He sat at the kitchen table, the same kind of table where I had helped him with homework decades earlier. I need your help. I said nothing. They're going to investigate. Who? And others. Why? Because he thinks I stole money. Did you? Andrew looked down. I moved money. That's not what I asked. He covered his face with his hands. I was trying to keep everything together. You lied to your wife. Silence. You lied to her family. Silence. You used my name. His shoulders shook. I was going to fix it. When? I don't know. I stared at my son. You asked me to hide you. I was scared, I know. Dad, please. He looked up. You've always protected me. I felt something inside me collapse, because he was right. I had. But there was something he didn't understand. Protection had a limit. I shook my head. Not this time. His eyes filled with tears. Please. I stood up. I love you. He looked at me. But I won't lie for you. You're my father. Yes, you have to help me. I am. He stared at me. How? By refusing to make this worse. I walked to the door. You need a lawyer. I already have one. Then listen to him. He stood. You're really doing this? I looked at him. No, Andrew, you did this. And I opened the door. The investigation unfolded over the following months. Andrew's company was audited. Financial records were reviewed. The false accounts were traced. The identity documents were examined. My name was removed from the transactions I hadn't authorized. The investigators eventually found evidence linking Andrew directly to the shell companies. I wasn't the man who destroyed his life. I was the man who stopped helping him destroy himself. That distinction mattered to me. Richard stood by his daughter. Emily eventually learned the full truth. She was devastated, not because Andrew had lied about business, because he had lied about me. She called me one evening. "Mr. Bennett." "Michael is fine," she cried. "I thought you abandoned him." "I know. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because he asked me not to." She was quiet, then she asked, "Why did you agree?" "I thought about it. Because I was still his father." She began crying harder. "I treated you terribly. You didn't know. But I believed him. So did I." That surprised her. She asked, "What do you mean?" "I believed the version of my son I wanted to believe." There was a long silence. Then she said, "I hope someday you can forgive him." I looked out the window. "I already do." "For what?" "Being human." I paused. "But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen." Months later, Andrew came to see me again. He had resigned from his company. The legal case was ongoing. His marriage had been deeply damaged. His reputation was gone. He looked different, smaller, not physically, emotionally. He sat on my porch. "I used to think you were embarrassed by me." I stared at him. "What?" "You worked construction." "I did." "You never went to fancy schools." "No." "You didn't have money like Emily's family." "No." "I thought if people knew you were my father, they'd think less of me." I said nothing. He looked down. "But tonight I finally understand." I waited. "You weren't the person I needed to hide." He swallowed. "I was." Those words were enough. Not an apology, not a defense, just the truth. I placed my hand on his shoulder. "You were never a disappointment to me, Andrew," he cried. "I know that now." We sat quietly, then he asked, "Do you hate me?" "No." "Why not?" I smiled sadly. "Because I remember the little boy who couldn't sleep without checking that I was still in the house." He laughed through his tears. "I remember that." "I do too." He wiped his face. "I destroyed everything." "No." I shook my head. "You destroyed the lie." He looked at me. "What about the rest?" "The rest you have to rebuild." He nodded. For the first time, I believed he might. For years, I thought the worst thing my son had done was tell people I wasn't his father. It wasn't. The worst thing was that I believed hiding me would protect him. I accepted being invisible because I thought love required sacrifice. But sacrifice has a limit. There comes a moment when staying silent is no longer kindness. It becomes participation. I didn't expose Andrew because I wanted revenge. I told the truth because other people were being harmed by his lies. Richard could have lost millions. Emily's family could have lost everything they had trusted him with. Employees could have lost their jobs, and I could have lost my identity. My silence would not have saved any of them. It would only have delayed the damage. I still speak to Andrew. Our relationship is not what it was. Maybe it never will be. Trust doesn't come back because someone says sorry. It comes back slowly through small things. Keeping promises, telling the truth, showing up, accepting consequences. Andrew has started again. Not with a company, not with money. With small architectural projects. He rents a modest apartment. He drives an old car. And for the first time in his adult life, he pays for his own life without pretending to be someone else. He calls me every Sunday. Sometimes we talk for 20 minutes, sometimes an hour. Last Sunday he asked, "Dad, are you coming to my next presentation?" I smiled. "Do you want me there?" "Yes." "Then I'll come." He laughed. "I'll introduce you properly this time." I laughed too. Good. Because after everything, there was one thing I had never stopped being, his father, and one thing I would never again allow him, or anyone else, to make me ashamed of that truth. My son once whispered, "Don't tell them you're my father." I stayed quiet, until his father-in-law asked me one question. That question didn't destroy my son's life. His own choices did. What changed my life was realizing that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is stop protecting a grown child from the consequences of his own decisions. I didn't expose him to punish him. I stopped hiding because the truth had become more important than his image. And in the end, that truth gave both of us something his lies never could. A real relationship. Not one built on money, not one built on fear, not one built on pretending. Just a father and his son, finally standing in the same room without either of us having to hide. If this story made you think about family secrets, loyalty, or the moment when protecting someone becomes enabling them, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the story, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more emotional stories about family, betrayal, consequences, and second chances. 12. The letter that arrived 6 months. Later, 6 months after Andrew left my house that night, I received a letter, not an email, not a text, a handwritten letter. I recognized his handwriting immediately. I opened it at my kitchen table. The first line said, "Dad, I don't know how to ask you to forgive me, so I'm not going to ask." I stopped reading for years. I had imagined what Andrew might say if he ever admitted what he'd done. I had expected excuses, blame, maybe even anger. Instead, he had written something different. He told me that the investigation had uncovered more than he had expected. There had been debts I hadn't known about, investments that had failed, promises he couldn't keep, people he had deceived. But the part that bothered him most wasn't the money. It was the lie about me. He wrote, "I didn't hide you because I was ashamed of you." Then he crossed out the sentence. Underneath it, he wrote, "I hid you because I was ashamed of myself." I read that line 3 times, then I continued. He explained that when he entered Emily's family, he had felt small. Her father was wealthy. Her brothers ran successful businesses. Her family talked about investments, property, private schools, and expensive vacations, as if those things were normal parts of life. Andrew wanted to belong, so he created a version of himself that belonged. He stopped talking about the apartment where he grew up. He stopped mentioning the years when money was tight. He stopped talking about my construction jobs. And eventually, he stopped talking about me. At first, it had been omission, then embarrassment, then a lie, then another, until the lie became so large that telling the truth felt impossible. I closed my eyes, because suddenly I understood something. He hadn't spent years running away from me. He had spent years running away from the boy he used to be. And somehow, he had convinced himself that if he erased his past, he could become the man he wanted to be. It hadn't worked. It had only made him afraid. Afraid that someone would discover where he came from. Afraid that someone would discover who he really was. Afraid that someone would discover me. I finished the letter. At the end, he wrote, "You once taught me that a strong building needs a foundation. I thought that meant money. Now I understand it means truth." I sat there for a long time. Then I folded the letter. I didn't call him. Not yet. I wasn't ready. Forgiveness had happened quietly inside me months earlier. Trust was different. Trust needed proof. 3 weeks later, Andrew knocked on my door. I opened it. He was holding a toolbox. I looked at him. "What happened?" "I noticed your porch railing is loose." I almost laughed. So I thought I'd fix it." He walked past me before I could answer. I followed him outside. He placed the toolbox on the porch and inspected the railing. "You could have hired someone." "I know." "Then why did you come?" He looked at me. "Because I wanted to do something useful." That sentence stayed with me. Not "I want forgiveness." Not "I need money." Not "Can you help me?" Just "I wanted to do something useful." He spent an hour fixing the railing. He replaced 2 screws, reinforced the wood underneath, sandpapered the rough edge. When he finished, he stepped back. "There. I tested it. It was solid. Good job." He smiled. "Thanks." We stood there awkwardly. Then he said, "Dad?" "Yes." "Can I come by next Sunday?" "Why, I have nowhere to be." That answer broke something in me. Not in a painful way, in a human way. I nodded. "Sure." And he came the next Sunday and the one after that. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we worked, sometimes we said almost nothing. Slowly, something changed. He stopped trying to impress me. He stopped trying to explain himself. He simply showed up. Then one afternoon, Emily came to my house. She stood on the porch. She looked nervous. "Can I come in?" "Of course." She sat in the living room. For a few minutes, she looked at the old photographs on the wall. Then she said, "I owe you an apology. You don't have to." "I do." She folded her hands. "I believed things about you without asking." I nodded. "I thought Andrew had been abandoned." "I know. I thought you weren't around because you didn't care. I know." She looked at me. "And I judged you." I smiled slightly. "You believed what your husband told you. That doesn't make it right." "No." She took a breath. "Can I tell you something?" "Yes. When I first met Andrew, he told me his father had died." I frowned. "He said that?" She nodded. "He said you died when he was young." I stared at her. For years I had known Andrew had hidden me, but hearing that made it different. "He told you I was dead?" "Yes." I looked toward the window. "That explains a lot." Emily looked ashamed. I've spent a long time wondering why he would say something like that. I knew the answer. Fear, pride, shame. "Maybe all three," she asked. "Why did you stay quiet?" I looked at her. "I thought I was protecting him." She nodded slowly. "And were you?" "No." I smiled sadly. "I was protecting the lie." She lowered her eyes. "That makes sense." Then she said something I never expected. "I'm glad you're his father." I looked at her. "Why? Because I think you're the only person he still listens to." I laughed softly. "He didn't listen to me very well for a long time. He does now." I looked toward the kitchen. Maybe she was right. A year after the anniversary dinner, Andrew invited me to a small architectural conference. He was presenting a project, his own project, no investors, no wealthy family connections, no borrowed identity, just his work. Before the presentation began, he walked over to me. "Dad, yes? You know the people I'm about to introduce you to?" "No." He smiled. "Good." Then he turned toward a group of architects. "Everyone, this is my father, Michael Bennett." I froze, not because it was dramatic, because it was ordinary. 3 simple words. My father. No explanation, no apology, no hesitation, just the truth. One of the architects shook my hand. "Nice to meet you." Another said, "Andrew talks about you all the time." I looked at Andrew. He smiled. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For years, I had wanted acknowledgement. When it finally came, I realized I didn't need an audience. I only needed him to say it. After the presentation, he found me outside. "Well, you did good." He grinned. "Just good?" "Very good." He laughed. Then he asked, "Were you nervous?" "No." "You should have been." I smiled. "I've been through worse rooms." He laughed again. We walked toward the parking lot. And for the first time in years, I wasn't following behind my son. I was walking beside him. Sometimes people ask me what I would have done differently. The answer isn't simple. I wouldn't change the years I spent raising Andrew. I wouldn't change the sacrifices. I wouldn't change selling my truck. I wouldn't change paying for his education. I wouldn't change standing beside him when his mother died. Those things were love. I don't regret them. What I would change is what came after. I should have stopped rescuing him when he became an adult. I should have told him that success built on secrecy eventually collapses. I should have asked harder questions. And most importantly, I should have remembered that being a father does not mean carrying responsibility for every decision your adult child makes. You can love someone without protecting them from reality. That was the lesson I learned too late, but I learned it. And sometimes learning late is better than never learning at all. I used to think being a good father meant being the man who was always there to solve things. Now I think it means something different. It means being there when someone is telling the truth. It means showing up when there is nothing to gain. It means refusing to lie for someone you love. It means allowing them to experience consequences without abandoning them. Andrew doesn't need me to fix his life anymore. That is probably the healthiest thing that has ever happened between us. He still calls when something matters. He still comes over. He still asks my opinion. But now when he asks, I give advice. I don't rescue. That difference has made our relationship stronger. And I think he finally understands what I was trying to teach him all those years ago. A father's love isn't measured by how much he can give. Sometimes it's measured by whether he can stand beside his son while his son learns to become responsible for himself. I still think about that hotel ballroom, the chandeliers, the expensive suits, the people who knew Andrew as a successful businessman, and me, sitting quietly in the back, a man who was told not to reveal who he was. At the time, I thought that night represented the greatest humiliation of my life. Now I see it differently. That night exposed a lie that had been growing for years. And when Richard asked, "Are you Andrew's father?" I finally stopped protecting the wrong thing. I told the truth. Yes, I was his father. I am his father. Nothing Andrew ever did changed that. Not the money, not the lies, not the shame, not the people he tried to impress. And perhaps that is why, in the end, the truth survived everything else. My son once whispered, "Don't tell them you're my father." I stayed quiet, until someone asked me who I really was. Now, when my son introduces me, he doesn't whisper, he says it clearly. This is my father, and every time I hear those words, I realize something. The greatest revenge was never exposing him. It was living long enough to see him stop hiding. That was the justice I wanted, not his failure, not his punishment, his honesty. And after everything we lost, that was the one thing worth getting back. 2 years passed after the night at the hotel. Life became quieter. Andrew continued rebuilding his career. Emily and Andrew eventually decided to live separately. They did not rush into divorce, but they also stopped pretending everything was normal. Richard and I remained in contact. It was an unusual friendship. We had met because our children had lied to both of us. But in some strange way, that shared experience had created a bond. One Saturday morning, Richard called me. "Michael, yes, I need to ask you something." "What?" "Are you sitting down?" I laughed. That usually isn't a good sign. He paused. "Andrew has been offered a major project." "That sounds good." "It is. So what's the problem?" "The client knows about his past." I became quiet. "What do they know?" "Everything." I thought about it. "And they still want him?" "Yes, then maybe they've seen the man he's become." Richard laughed. "That's what I told him." There was another pause. "There's something else." "What?" "They want you there." I frowned. "Why?" "They want to meet the person Andrew credits with teaching him how to rebuild." I smiled. "I never taught him how to rebuild." Richard laughed. "Maybe not intentionally. The project was a community center, not a luxury hotel, not a private residence, not a corporate headquarters. A community center in an older neighborhood where most families couldn't afford expensive private facilities. The project had a modest budget, but it mattered to Andrew. When he showed me the plans, I noticed something. A large workshop room occupied one side of the building. "What is this?" "A woodworking space." I looked at him. "Why?" He smiled. "Because of you." I laughed. "You're putting a workshop in a community center because I worked construction?" "Not exactly." He pointed to the plans. "When I was a kid, I used to think the best thing about your work was that you could make something useful with your hands." I smiled. "You used to complain that I smelled like sawdust. I was 12. You were dramatic. So were you." We laughed, then he became serious. "I want kids who don't have much money to have a place where they can build things." I looked at the plans again. "This is a good idea." "I hope so." "It is." He looked relieved. Then he said, "I put your name on the workshop." I stared at him. "What?" "Michael Bennett Workshop." I shook my head. "Take it off." He laughed. "You always do that." "What?" "Refuse anything that sounds sentimental." "Because I'm not sentiment," he smiled. "You are." I wasn't going to argue. A month later, the community center held a fundraising dinner. I almost didn't go. I wasn't comfortable in large rooms anymore. Andrew insisted. "You're coming." "I've already seen enough fancy dinners." This one is different. How? You won't have to pretend you're nobody. That sentence made me stop. He was right, so I went. When Andrew stood to speak, he looked toward me. Then he said, "Before I talk about this project, I want to acknowledge one person." I knew immediately. My chest tightened. My father. People turned toward me. Andrew continued. "Some of you know him, some don't." He smiled, but he taught me something I forgot for a long time. The room became quiet. He taught me that success isn't about appearing successful. Andrew paused. It's about being able to tell the truth about who you are when nobody is impressed. I looked down. I could hear applause beginning. Then Andrew said, "This building has a workshop named after him, because I wanted his name attached to something that helps people instead of hiding it." I looked at my son. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't looking at the wealthy people in the room to see what they thought of him. He was simply looking at me. And for the first time, I realized he didn't need their approval anymore. Neither did I. After the dinner, Richard and I stood outside. He handed me a glass of water. "Are you proud of him?" I looked through the window. Andrew was talking to a group of young architects. "Yes, even after everything." "Yes," Richard smiled. "I knew you'd say that." I looked at him. "What did you expect?" He laughed. "Honestly, what?" "I expected you to hate him. I thought about that. I tried." "Did it work?" "No." "Why?" I smiled. "Because he's my son." Richard nodded. Then he asked one final question. "Do you think he would have changed if we hadn't found the truth?" I didn't answer immediately. Finally, I said, "No." Richard looked surprised. "Why?" "Because consequences only work when someone is allowed to experience them." He nodded. "And you were the one person who could have prevented those consequences." "Yes." I looked toward the parking lot, and that's why staying quiet had become the wrong kind of love. Richard smiled. "I think that's the wisest thing you've said all night. I've had 2 years to practice. Andrew and I have a different relationship now. Not perfect, better than perfect perhaps. Real, we still disagree. He still drives me crazy. Sometimes I still call him too often. Sometimes he still forgets to call me back. We're father and son. We don't need a dramatic ending to prove that. We just need honesty." A few months ago, we were sitting in my kitchen. He looked around. "This place hasn't changed. Neither have I." He laughed. "That's debatable." Then he became quiet. "Dad?" "Yes. Do you ever wish you had walked away from me?" "I thought about it. From you?" "Yes." "No." He looked relieved. "But," I added, "I wish I had walked away from your problems sooner." He nodded. "I understand. I didn't know the difference back then." I didn't either. We sat in silence. Then he said, "You know what I remember most from when I was a kid?" "What?" "You always told me, 'I can help you, but I can't live your life for you.'" I smiled. "I said that all the time." "I should have listened to myself," he laughed. "Me too. For a long time I thought the hotel incident was about being rejected by my son. It wasn't. It was about the danger of allowing someone else's shame to become your identity. Andrew was ashamed of where he came from. I let that shame make me feel ashamed of myself. That's what I finally had to change. I had worked construction. I had lived in a modest house. I had raised a child after losing my wife. I had made mistakes. Struggled. I had sacrificed. None of those things were embarrassing. They were my life. And perhaps the strangest part of the entire story is that the thing Andrew tried hardest to hide became one of the things he eventually became proud of, his father. Not a wealthy father, not a connected father, not a powerful father. Just his father, the man who stayed, the man who worked, the man who kept showing up, the man who finally learned that love does not mean protecting someone from every consequence. Sometimes love means standing far enough back for them to see what their choices have done. Then being there when they decide to change. Last Christmas, Andrew gave me a small wooden box. I opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was old, faded around the edges. It showed Andrew at about 8 years old. He was sitting on my shoulders. I was laughing. He was holding a toy airplane. On the back, Andrew had written, My first safe place. I looked at him. "What is this?" he shrugged. "I found it in an old box." I turned the photograph over again. "I thought you should have it." I swallowed. "Thank you." He smiled, then he hugged me. Not quickly, not awkwardly. He held me like a son holds his father when there is nothing left to prove. After he left, I put the photograph on my desk. I still look at it sometimes. And whenever I do, I remember the hotel, the ballroom, the whisper, the shame in my son's eyes, and the question Richard asked, "Are you Andrew's father?" For years, I thought that question had exposed my son. Now I realize it exposed something in me too. I had spent so long protecting the person I loved that I had forgotten to protect the truth. I know better now. And because I know better, my son and I finally have something we never had before. Not a perfect relationship, not a painless one, a truthful enough, maybe more than enough. Because my son once whispered, "Don't tell them you're my father." Today, when someone asks who I am, Andrew answers before I can. He smiles and says, "This is my dad," and I no longer hear those words as a reward. I hear them as truth, the kind that survives embarrassment, the kind that survives money, the kind that survives betrayal, and the kind that, after everything, can still bring a father and son back to each other.